Hi, folks. Welcome to our webinar series, the Zero Trust Club. We're now at episode 3, where we're going to talk about cyber threats, the different types of attacks organizations are facing today, and how you can protect your users. My name is Tarun. I'm the EVP of Cloud Secure Edge at SonicWall. And with me is Doug McKee. Doug, do you want to introduce yourself?
I'm the Executive Director of Threat Research here at SonicWall. I've been in cybersecurity. Oh, that's a scary number now. I guess it's been, 15, 16 years messing around as a hacker and an all-around defender for threats. And I'm primarily responsible for looking at our threat data that we collect through our telemetry and all of our products and looking for trends and also ensuring that in our firewall product that we have the right protections in place and signatures on a daily basis.
Awesome. And so we have, in this webinar, we're going to talk about the different types of attacks and how you can protect yourselves. And so I'm going to kick off a poll for those interested. And the different types of attacks are as follows, right? We're going to talk about business email compromise. We're going to talk about server-side request forgery, ransomware, malware, mobile attack, privilege escalation. So let's get started, Doug. Let's actually go with the first one on my list. And as the survey results come in, we'll adjust. The first one we have is business email compromise. And so the concept of business email compromise is today everyone uses email to do their jobs, right? Like Microsoft 365, Google Workspace, but some people still host their own email servers. And the idea behind business email compromise is the bad guys get access to your email. So how does that happen, and what are some of the implications?
Yeah, I mean, business email compromise it's on the rise too. We like to talk often about the ransomware, as a big one in the industry. We like to talk about some of these other attacks, but we're actually seeing business email compromise as one of the main attack vectors attackers are using. Why is that? Is because it's exploiting trust at the end of the day. When attackers are getting into email often using phishing or other techniques to gain credentials, right? They're impersonating that person. So there's a natural trust between the person sending the email and the person receiving the email. And that's what attackers are leveraging. Oftentimes you're seeing them use it to get unauthorized like money transfers, for example, or they're using it to get access to other systems to gain more sensitive data access. But I think the stat that we're looking at here is about 1 in every 3 reported insurance claim in 2024 was related to business email compromise.
Yeah. And the one thing I've read is that, or we've actually seen, is that it's not a straightforward, hey, I just got your email password and I got into your email. So what happens sometimes is they will set up a forwarding rule. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
They will just basically go in and set up a blank forwarding rule where essentially when an email comes in, it'll get forwarded to, they will use some of the most sophisticated capabilities of your email service. They will forward the email and delete the email from your inbox. So it's not like you can even see what they're doing, right? At the system level, some of this correspondence you won't even see. So the person who's attacked will continue working. It'll all be fine. But every now and then there'll be 1 or 2 emails that they just miss. And those 1 or 2 emails could be, triggering a wire, for example, from a bank account, or approving something as simple as an invoice, but it's actually kind of a fake invoice.
I think another one we see too is approving access to code repo servers, right? So like a lot of times when we're talking about development and getting access to source code, like there's an approval chain to get those permissions. And if that email comes from like the VP of engineering, for example, then you're likely to get that approval or clicking on that approval from an automated system and making sure that email never appears in the inbox to what you're saying. And that's to get to the next level of the attack chain. Like how are the attackers moving? They don't always want to be discovered right away. If they do, they use ransomware. We'll talk about that later, right? But with business email compromise, they don't always want you to know they're there, and they want to continue to milk that for the most they can get out of it.
So the key element of business email compromise is they get your trust. They have a trusted ID with which they get approvals or they get something going. Yeah, and protecting against these kinds of attacks is both simple and very complicated, I would say. What are some of the simple steps that you would do to protect against business email compromise?
Some of the simple steps, I mean, it goes back to some of those industry best practices that we talked about for the last decade, right, Tarun? And I mean, remember we mentioned they had to get access to start with in order to set up those forwarding rules or to send that email. So we want to prevent that initial access from ever occurring. So that's strong passwords. That's making sure you understand how phishing works, and having the appropriate training in place for that phishing. Those are some of the multi-factor authentication. Those are probably the top three when we're talking about the super basics from compromised email. But why don't you tell us a little bit more about some of the more complex ones? That might be more interesting to folks.
Yeah. So I think the basic ones, I would say everybody must do, right? Please put, especially if you're using Google Workspace or Microsoft 365, they make this so easy. Strong password, multi-factor authentication is just a must-have. And that they give you baked in. But oftentimes those are not enough because users get tired. Users are on their mobile devices, for example. And, it's easy for you to just, for example, steal a mobile device while they're away at the coffee shop and just go in there, put a forwarding rule in. So some of them slightly more sophisticated, again, not too sophisticated. The first is actually blocking malicious websites. Most business email compromise happens because they get a link, they click on the link will open a browser, the browser will encourage them to do something that will eventually come back and compromise the email system. Or from the browser, they will download a piece of malware that will compromise the device. So one aspect is definitely filtering links, URL filtering, web filtering. That falls in the zero trust security bucket. The second one is using device trust and device posture. So many people allow email access from any device. Right? That's the definition of Microsoft 365. I can go to any browser, log into Microsoft 365, which is fine if it's personal email. Personal email, I should be logged into everywhere. But if it's corporate email, and so much work gets done on corporate email, and it's no longer just Microsoft 365. Microsoft 365 is connected to the Drive. It's connected to the online PowerPoint. It's connected to online. So what you want to do is just ensure that only trusted devices can access your corporate email. And that is very simple, actually. Just during the authentication flow, just make sure the user is coming from the corporate device. And again,
you can add an extra step on that. It's not just the corporate device, but it's the expected location of the device as well. Yes. And that's one of the other things, anomaly detection to put into place and to make sure you have someone monitoring for that anomaly detection. But, Tarun, I know you travel a bit for work, but there's no way you can be in San Francisco and Italy at the same time. Yeah. I'm sorry, like that doesn't work, So, when those type of alerts do a lot as well.
Yes, exactly. Like that's called impossible travel. But I mean, you can get more and more sophisticated, but the basic one is just, the way we do it is we put a certificate on a device. If you have a mobile phone, we put a certificate on the mobile phone. If you have a Windows laptop, Mac laptop, we put a certificate on there. And then if you don't have the certificate, we're going to say, hey, and then part of the certificate, we also score the device. We look if the firewall is, we do a few other device posturing. But the general idea is if you have a trusted device, then you can access that application. It's a very simple concept. It's hard to implement, but once you implement it, it becomes pretty straightforward to use. But that's a very powerful protection, because one of the reasons business email compromise is so common is because anybody can access your Gmail account from any browser. And that's the power of Gmail, but it's also the risk associated with Gmail. So that's definitely one area where zero trust security, that mindset can really protect you against business email compromise.
Yeah, we like our conveniences, right?
Yes.
And those conveniences are what you're talking about, like that turns into the risk. So oftentimes I like to talk about, we have to balance that, as organizations, essentially like the CISO's job, mitigating risk and ensuring that, they're taking the appropriate risk. And sometimes you have to ask the hard question, like, do we need to be able to access S from anywhere in the world? Like, is that actually a business requirement? Do we need to access it from any device? And sometimes that's a good conversation to have. And emails become one of those things that, we do often need access to it all over the place. So now we need to put the appropriate steps in place to do that as secure as possible.
And the steps cannot be too onerous. Like if you make it, back in the day, people used to enforce like a full tunnel in order to access email. People just revolted. Users revolted. The full tunnel is too onerous a system. You need to find a user experience that is actually compatible with what your modern users expect nowadays. So you want to put a device trust policy in place, but you have to make it dead simple. If you make it too hard, people are going to revolt.
No, I think that there's so much truth in that, because what ends up happening is your own users end up being the bad guys, end up being
Yes.
the threat actors, because they then look for ways to circumvent the security that you've put in place to just do their regular job, which ends up opening more holes or more risks in your network
Yeah.
than if you just make it easy for them. So absolutely, like whatever solution you're going to use to provide that isolation needs to be easy, both have a good user experience and be easy to implement for your IT team.
Awesome. All right. So I'm just going to summarize the poll results so far. Business email compromise got a few votes. Ransomware and malware, which is still the most popular subject, got the most votes. Privilege escalation got a few votes. So maybe we'll respect the audience. We'll go to ransomware and malware and then come back to SSRF stuff.
Sure.
So we covered business email compromise, which is essentially the idea that your Microsoft 365, your Google Workspace accounts gets compromised, and then attackers use that trust to move around and do crazy things. Let's switch a little bit and talk about ransomware and malware. What kind of attacks are you seeing there? What are the implications of those types of attacks?
Well, as we pull together, we're currently, like, my team is in the stage of pulling together all the 2024 data. Right, we're getting ready to launch our 2020. Well, it's in 2025, but it's our 2024 threat report. And so we're taking a look at, like, what does that look like 2023 compared to 2024 when it comes to malware and ransomware. And I think some of the most interesting things is, like, guess what, guys? It's not going away. Like, right,
Mhm.
like the numbers are still going up. One of the ways I like to look at ransomware data is by geographic region. And so Latin America in 2024, we saw a 259% increase in ransomware, which is really interesting. And it's up in North America as well, right? So, like, we're still seeing that rise, but it's a lot to say. A clear way of saying that ransomware is still a big problem. I think another interesting thing to look at is in 2024 specifically, when we're talking about ransomware, it has different impacts across different industries. One of the industries that we're still seeing an incredible impact that ransomware is having is the healthcare industry.
I see.
When we sit down and we try to crunch the numbers, we're seeing somewhere around 198 million patients were affected because of ransomware. Like, their care was potentially affected as a result of ransomware in 2024. So I mean, it's definitely not going away. And I know malware. We're talking about malware as well, but I'll just start there with ransomware, since it seems to be one of the hot topics. And I think there's a lot to talk about when we say, okay, well, what do we have to do to this keeps going up? Like, we have to slow this problem down. Like, how are we going to slow this problem down? And I think a lot of the conversation does revolve around that concept of isolation and ensuring that we don't allow so much success. What do you think about that, Tarun?
Yeah, one point before we jump into how we would solve it. Why is healthcare always the target of these types of attacks? Like, what is it about healthcare systems that make it so susceptible to ransomware attacks?
Well, I think so. Some of this is Doug's opinion, right? Like, there's not necessarily concrete evidence to support why healthcare, but specifically, but a lot of what I've seen over the years is ransomware is all about financial gain, right? It's all
Mhm.
about making money. So you have to, in order to be successful at financial gain, you have to be in a scenario where someone's willing to pay, and they have to
Mhm.
have the money to give it to you, right? If you're attacking an industry that has no money, it doesn't matter how much you demand; they don't have the money, right? Well, what happens is healthcare meets a really interesting cross section of an industry that has a lot of funds typically, and they end up paying because they have competing number one priorities, which is
Yep.
really, really hard to deal with. How do you take the value of human life and say, listen, I've got a patient or a group of patients or 1,000 patients that I have to get to today
Yeah.
because their health is on the line. And how do I compare that to a ransomware game is asking me for X amount of dollars? I've For better or worse, I have the dollars. And if there's a chance that it's going to allow me to save human life, then I'm
You're
going
gonna.
to spend those
Yeah.
dollars. So it puts these healthcare providers in this impossible position of juggling human life and paying the bad actors. And so, what I think we see is the threat actors go there because it works. And then lastly, along those lines, in order for it to work, you have to have a population and a set of systems that are likely going to make it relatively easy for the attackers to gain that initial access.
Yeah.
And the unfortunate reality is healthcare systems oftentimes are slightly behind when it
Yeah.
comes to patching, when it comes to using the latest technology. Some of the time that's due to regulatory restrictions, and it takes a lot longer to get that stuff in the field. Other times it has to do, even though the healthcare industry has funds, it's easy to say, oh, just upgrade that device. Well, now I have to upgrade 1,000 of them, and that might be $14 million across 35 hospital systems. So I think there's a lot of logistics at play, and it just kind of makes the perfect storm of an area where people are going to get paid, right? You like to get paid, Tarun, right?
Exactly.
You get paid, and it's how they're getting paid.
And I think there's one financial incentive here. Most healthcare providers have cyber insurance. So the bad guys know that as long as they set the ransom low enough, they're going to pay it because insurance is going to cover it, which is a double-edged sword in many ways, because you don't actually do the security fix. You're just relying on cyber insurance to cover your backside.
Yeah, I think cyber insurance is also an interesting topic, because I think you're starting to see some of that change too, is about cyber insurance always just de factoing paying out these large sums for ransom. There's a lot of things that the insuree, I think is the right term, the person being insured, or company being insured, they've got to do some of the things you and I were just talking about to even for that insurance policy to kick in. Right.
Yes.
So like that's a whole nother topic of conversation of, you just can't say, oh, well, I'm insured, I don't need to do these, best practices. That's not usually the case anymore.
Yeah. So maybe the way I would think about ransomware and malware, I put them together only because they're kind of well-known threats. They've been around for a while. They're not going away. They're here. And the solutions to fix them have also been around for a while. Most malware is downloaded from the internet. So the days of Tom Cruise, Mission Impossible style, kind of flying in with a USB stick and attacking your supercomputer. That's not how it happens. Like, what happens is some guy goes on the internet, downloads a bad file, and that's how the malware gets in. So some of the basic hygiene is you have to sanitize the internet. Unfortunately, that's just the reality. The internet is growing faster than anyone can comprehend. As security vendors, we do our best. We're not 100% efficacious, but we will stop 90% of those attacks. So sanitizing the internet is one very basic check. Having good endpoint security on the devices is a requirement, right? Modern EDR tools, again, they will catch 90% of the attacks, but not 100%. Nothing is going to be 100%, but they'll catch a good. So some good hygiene around, sanitize the internet, make sure you don't hit malicious domains, have an EDR system running. And then the last thing, and SonicWall has been selling firewalls for 30 plus years, segment your network so people can't move laterally. It's not always easy to do this, but it's basic concepts like this. Or if you have a guest Wi-Fi, don't let the guest Wi-Fi land on your regular network. Basic concepts of segmentation, web filtering, and endpoint security. Unfortunately, that's what you have to do to protect against these attacks.
Man, anytime someone says that to me, I end up telling this story, but I used to do a lot of pen testing and consulting in the healthcare industry. And I walked into one customer, and I never left the waiting room. I sat in the waiting room I never asked for Wi-Fi credentials. I just sat in the waiting room on the guest Wi-Fi. And the short version of the story is, right, I was able to compromise all the way to their electronic medical record system, right? And so, that's so true about, hey, like this same old stuff, right? You have to be able to segmentation, firewalls, and don't put the guest Wi-Fi on the same network as the doctors are on, right? It's fantastic.
Awesome. So that was ransomware and malware. And, if folks have more questions or specific questions and you want to put Doug on the spot, hey, this is your time, go for it. But in the interest of time, I want to move on a little bit and talk about an attack. By the way, this is very noticeable, Doug. Nobody in the poll, we had about 10 or 15 responses, but nobody in the poll called out any interest in server-side request forgery, or SSRF. And on one hand, I want to listen to people, but on the other hand, this was such an interesting attack. I feel like you have to tell us more and why we should pay attention.
I find myself in that position a lot, Drew. Nobody wants to talk about what I want to talk about, right? So we always end up talking about other things. But no, I think this is a really interesting one, and you're going to see more come out about this in the threat report here in about a month or so. But we're seeing a huge increase. And when I say huge, get ready for this number, 452% increase in SSRF attacks from 2023 to 2024. So while it might not be the favorite topic on the poll, and maybe it's something that we should be talking about.
Yes.
And I think, why is that? Like, what is causing that increase? And I think there's two things that we can talk about, right? One is they're very simple attacks, and you can leverage SSRF attacks a lot to get the next step in whatever you're trying to do, right? I've seen SSRF attacks used for port scanning even, right? Or in order to get information from an internal server. We're talking about something about isolation, right, Tarun? And these attacks depend on the ability for an attacker to manipulate a request that's going to a server and have it pull data from somewhere else. And 9 times out of 10, that's an internal thing.
So maybe let's just define SSRF, at least the way I understand it. See, most web applications are multi-layered applications. It's not just one monolith. There's a web server. The web server will talk to an application server. The application server will talk to a database, or it might talk to other application servers. So what an SSRF attack does is it spoofs the first request to then fool a subsequent server into making a request that it normally wouldn't make. Like, for example, when I talk to the database and I log in as Doug and I talk to the database, I should only get Doug's results back. But you can spoof a request. So when I log in as Doug, it'll return Tarun's results, for example. And this is a very common attack. It's been around for many years. What has changed recently is these new AI tools have so much information about how Apache works, about how web applications work. They're able to construct scripts with hundreds of permutations and combinations, run them all in parallel, and find these vulnerabilities essentially well before any human even knows about them. Or these AI bots are scanning the CVEs. So they read the CVEs before it's been published, and then they will find the web applications that are vulnerable and attack them with these SSRF attacks. And it's really enabled by this modern large language model, the ability for these bots to understand natural language in a way that they never could before.
Absolutely. And I think, you hit the nail on the head there. I think the strength is too, when you're talking about this type of code, oftentimes it's easy for the AI technology to understand. We're not talking about complex binary code, right?
Yeah.
And as a result of that, it's able to come up with these permutation and different types of these SSRF exploits, if you will, that normally would have required more either manual review and a higher knowledge set as well. And it's kind of that same kind of trend towards like almost, don't shoot me for saying this, but kind of similar like ransomware as a service, right? Well, it's become like SSRF as a service via AI, right? Like it's very, very accessible to people.
And the reason it's a high security risk is most modern web applications use kind of standard stacks. They're typically like WordPress or Drupal if they're internet-facing websites, or maybe Ruby on Rails or Django or something like that. These are fairly standard stacks, which will now have fairly standard SSRF attacks on them. And the reality is, by the time you patch it, the AI bot might have hit you and exfiltrated some data.
Yeah, and it also speaks to the move, and we've seen this again over the last several years, but the move to everything being a cloud app to begin with. Mm-hmm. These attacks didn't exist if we weren't using the type of applications that lend themselves to these type of attacks. And we're continue to see everybody wants the SaaS app, right? Everybody don't want to host it themselves. They want the easy web page. They want the dashboard, right? And all those things lend themselves to these type of attacks being more prevalent out there in the wild.
Yeah, and I would say there are two types. So one is if Microsoft has an SSRF vulnerability, the responsibility is on Microsoft to fix it. Like you should lock down authentication, make authentication strong. But if they have a vulnerability, they have hundreds of security researchers, they will fix it quickly. But if you happen to run a marketing website, or if you happen to run an ERP website and you put it on the cloud, you need to fix it. Like it needs to be your responsibility to keep it patched. And the reality is, as a small IT team, you can't always patch WordPress. You can't always patch that ERP software. So I would say from a zero trust perspective, the easiest way to protect yourself is to make sure private access is limited just to your users. And by your users, again, I don't mean username, password. Username, password, these AI bots will figure that out pretty fast. You have to lock it down to trusted devices. You have to lock it down to trusted networks. So you have to use that additional layer of security beyond user trust to lock down access to trusted devices, trusted networks, so that the AI bots, while they can impersonate a user, they can't impersonate a trusted device. Who knows, maybe in 5 years they can. But right now they can't. They can't yet impersonate a trusted device. They can't impersonate a trusted network. So they won't be able to launch these AI kind of attacks onto your web infrastructure. Maybe an analogous question: have there been some clear impacts from these SSRF attacks? Like, are they well documented at impact? Like, in addition to volume, like dollars, things like that.
I don't have any like financial metrics to throw out at you, but I think we're seeing a lot more in the media about these type of attacks, especially if you follow specific CVEs. You just mentioned Microsoft. There's been some big Microsoft SSRF vulnerabilities that come out over 2024. It's one of those things you kind of have to be looking for. But we've definitely seen an increase, and we're seeing our data obviously is showing that attackers are using them, and so that's the important thing.
Awesome. Yeah, I loved hearing about this one. This is something I studied maybe 5-10 years ago, but seeing kind of an old form attack being relevant again because of a new LLM technology is, I hope the audience appreciates it. I think, some of these, the impact of AI is often discussed, right? In my geeky circles, at least, we discuss this a lot. But it's very hard to predict the impact of AI. And this is one such. So, for example, the impact of the internet is the long form podcast. Who would have guessed that influencers is a whole category, right? Similarly, impact of AI. Who would have guessed SSRF attacks will just return in with
well, I mean, maybe you should ask the AI what the impact of AI is going to be and see how that pans out.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's awesome. All right. In the interest of time, let's try to cover the couple more. So the next one I want to talk about is mobile, and everyone has an iPhone or an Android device, and more and more of work is happening, especially after COVID. You're on the road, or you're at the airport, or you're in a coffee shop, and more of us are kind of doing our jobs without necessarily being at the office or even a home office. So can you tell us a little bit about mobile attacks and what you're seeing there?
Yeah, I mean, mobile attacks are, in some ways, they're really no different than, laptop or desktop or server type attack. Like, a lot of those same techniques are still viable because we are doing so much of our work on mobile devices. But I think where you got some unique things in the mobile space is you see a lot more fake applications in the mobile space than you necessarily do when you're talking about other user interfaces like laptop or desktop environments. We're seeing, and you see a lot more adware and spam in general that seems to be prevalent on devices in order to get you to click on that link that ends up being phishing and phishing link or download malware to your device. We're still seeing a lot of issues with what we call RATs, like remote access toolkits, again, being leveraged highly on mobile devices. I think when you talk about PDFs and QR codes are something that, what do we typically use with QR codes? Our phone, right? That's the whole point. Right? You take a picture of the QR code in order to go to a website. Well, we're still seeing a lot of those style attacks where QR codes are embedded with malicious data, and they're working really hard to make that website look like the legitimate one. One that I've seen recently is DocuSign, right? You get sent something that you have to sign. We're kind of programmed at this point to understand, my company is going to send me something via DocuSign that I need to check, and we kind of do it blindly. And these threat actors are doing a really good job at making like the DocuSign like the DocuSign email and the QR code look just like the real one. And then that goes to our mobile device, right? And then we're under attack from that perspective. So, yeah, definitely still continuing to see a lot of different attacks on the mobile platform.
There's another type of attack that I wouldn't put in this, but it's called MFA fatigue-based attacks, which is what happens oftentimes is and as an IT admin, you decide, yes, I'm going to enable multi-factor authentication, MFA. And I'm going to tie a user's authentication to their phone. And if you don't set it up right, every time the user enters their username and password, they get a multi-factor authentication, either a push notification or an SMS. And I'll tell you what, after 10 of these, the user is just sick and tired. Just sick and tired of it. And so they're just going to click on anything. They're just going to say yes, 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 yes. And essentially what the bad guys are able to do is they're able to monitor. So for example, you're in a coffee shop, they can't necessarily see your internet traffic, but they can see your DNS requests. So they kind of know when you're going to say Okta. So when you're going to Okta, they kind of sniff your username password and they send you an MFA at the same time. So you'll see two MFAs and you'll just say, yes, yes, yeah, that's me, that's me. And now they've compromised your session credential. And that's how a big Silicon Valley company called Twilio, that's exactly how they got hacked. So an admin was working remotely, was doing his job, but keeps getting MFAs from Okta. And they created a fake website, like twilio.okta.com, Twilio fake. And then they kind of convinced them to get into, and they got their single sign-on credential. And so thinking of mobile as, it is definitely a productivity enhancer, right? I spend like 7 hours a day on my phone. So if you took that away from me, I would be very pissed off. But at the same time, I think one aspect of security is you have to secure that mobile device. Like even if you as a company don't own my mobile device, if I'm going to do work on my mobile device, you have to put some basic standards on my mobile device.
And at this point, whether it's a policy or not, people are doing work on their mobile device.
Yeah, checking email. They're probably opening PowerPoints, or in my case, they'll do it while they're driving.
That's a whole different type of risk that we're not talking about today, Tarun.
Yeah. So the people are using their mobile devices. BYOD, bring your own device. I think that acronym is irrelevant. Everybody is bringing their own device.
Yeah.
There are some financial companies where, because of SEC regulations, they'll give you a separate phone, a corporate device. But many organizations just expect you to use your own phone, your personal phone.
Absolutely.
And so from a zero trust security perspective, I think phones need to have a basic hygiene. You have to ensure that they're not jailbroken. You have to ensure that they're registered, right? You can't, if you're going to work from your phone, that's fine, work from your phone, but you can't work from your daughter's phone. You have to work only from your phone. So you have to put you can't check email from your daughter's phone. You have to, so I think a basic posture standard, a basic hygiene requirement will go a long way in preventing some of these mobile attacks.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Right, you have to have some level of isolation and some level of trust with the end user, because at the end of the day, we're just trying to reduce our risk footprint, right? Like as you said, there's no security solution to what 90% is. I think what you were talking about before, like 90% of things. We're not going to get to a point where we're 100% protected, but we can drastically reduce our risk profile, and we're going to have people use their mobile devices, their personal mobile devices. So we're going to be susceptible to these type of attacks, but it doesn't have to be any device in the world, right? Yeah. And it does, and maybe in some cases, right, that device has to be on a VPN in order to access those resources, right? And that provides another layer of protection. And then we talk about, on my laptop, I can access these really sensitive resources. On my phone, maybe I can't access all the same number of resources. I've got that extra layer of isolation where I can access my email, or I can access maybe PowerPoint because I don't consider that as sensitive. But accessing the code repo, proprietary code, not allowed to do that from my phone, right? And so like those are all kind of guardrails we can put into place. We have to have something that we put into place to help reduce this risk.
Yeah. Although I'll just say, I do access code repos a lot from my phone. It's kind of horrible. You have to squint like this. But sometimes I'm on the road and I really want to understand why this bug is working. And I do it. But I think you bring up a good point in the other sense that the mobile form factor is different than desktop. You don't want to treat mobile just like you treat desktop. So I'll give you a specific example. As long as Android and iOS are not jailbroken, you typically cannot install the same type of malware that you could install on a desktop device. Applications are sandboxed. Application cannot traverse across applications. iOS and Android have very clear sandboxing limitations. Another example, in addition to malware, is what an application can do. Like an application on Windows can access your registry, can access the file system. By default, it can take super user privileges. On an iOS device, you have to grant it the privilege. You have to say, I will give this application
And
VPN. I
same,
will give.
same with Android, right? Like,
Yeah.
and a lot of people compare Android to Linux, and they're like, "Well, what's the difference? It's just a Linux machine." Actually, it's very different.
Yeah.
And Android has things way more locked down. And modern Android, right? We're not talking
Yes.
about 10 years ago.
Yes.
You know, modern Android is way more locked down than your Linux box, and so that's a good thing. But we
Yeah.
do want to make sure that we understand that we're treating them appropriately.
Yeah. So I think actually back in the day, BYOD was a security risk. People were really petrified that, oh my God, it's a personal device. Well, as the data has played out, it turns out the data and the application is actually pretty well secured. It's the access sometimes that gets lost, and it's more user-based attacks that are prevalent. And malware-based attacks on mobile are actually not as high as, say, on a desktop platform.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense to what we're seeing in the threat landscape, is for sure.
Awesome. So that's a great segue into the next, and at least for this discussion, unless there are further questions, the next one we want to talk about, which is escalation of privilege. What is escalation of privilege, and what type of attack does this entail?
Yeah, this is actually what I call one of the hidden gems of things to talk about, because I don't think it's talked about enough. And so, answering your question, what is privilege escalation? It's saying that an attacker already has access to your system. They figured that part out, right? So we're not talking about that initial access. They've got access, but what they really want is they want privileged access, or they want higher permissions. They want to be able to do more. So what is it that they have to do to get that high level access on your system? And so we talk about privilege escalation vulnerabilities, privilege escalation exploits. What I think the interesting nuance is when we're talking about privilege escalation is that it's often rated as a lower risk. And it's rated as a lower risk because you have to get access first.
Yep.
And so when we talk about metrics and we're thinking in our organizations, how do I prioritize, different threats and different attacks? These kind of get pushed in the corner. But with that said, is what we've seen in the threat landscape is initial access is not the challenge for attackers, right? Because of business email compromise, because of phishing, because of all these other things we've already talked about, that initial access is actually not that difficult. They want to be able to get the good stuff. And so I think Microsoft's a really good example of this. 38%, the largest portion of vulnerabilities that are leveraged against Microsoft products are escalation of privilege vulnerabilities in 2024, which means that we like to talk about remote code execution, memory corruption. And don't get me wrong, those are important. Those also get like the really high metrics.
Right.
But what we're seeing is threat actors aren't using those, at least when it comes as often. They're mostly focusing on using those elevation of privilege escalation. Elevation of privilege escalation. I can't talk anymore. You get where I'm going with this. They're using elevation of privilege vulnerabilities and exploits more often.
Yes.
And I think that's a really interesting data point, because we have to adapt our defenses to in order to understand that, okay, maybe I need to pay more attention to this class of attacks, even though some of our metrics that we like to use are saying they're less important.
Yeah. So, but just to be clear, you can only elevate privilege if you're already in the network, you're already in the system.
Correct.
And so you almost have to have a security model that assumes the bad guy is in your network.
I think that's exactly what has to happen. You have to assume compromise.
Yeah. And by the way, that was the original reason why the term zero trust was coined. So zero trust has been bastardized and now means many things to many people. But originally, the idea behind zero trust was have zero trust in the network because the bad guys have probably gotten it. Like that was the original meaning of the word zero trust. And it is very powerful today, because today most applications are on the internet, and which means the bad guys have direct access anyway. And so, but keeping that in mind, I think, is a core concept in zero trust. You have to assume that things that you trust, you still need to explicitly verify that they are still trustworthy. And
I was gonna say I've been quoted with a relatively unpopular opinion around zero trust, but saying to the effect that zero trust is defense in depth rebranded.
Yes.
Right? Because at the end of the day, that's what we're talking about. Like, you have to have layers of defenses that go all the way through initial compromise.
Yes.
To be able to prevent these type of attacks.
Yeah. And a very simple, very specific here is, most people say they have a server running in their office. right? You would just say, hey, if I have access to the office network, I should be able to SSH or RDP into that server. Well, I would say zero trust would say that's not right. You can't just RDP or SSH into the server because you're on the network. We're still going to validate all your security posture requirements as though you were coming from the internet. We're going to make you authenticate. I want to see your user credential. We're going to make sure you're on a trusted device. And only then are we going to let you in. I'm not saying lock it down so only Tom Cruise Mission Impossible style is going to get in, but the same checks. It doesn't matter if you're in the office or you're removed from the office. The same checks have to be done before you grant access. And if you don't do that, these privilege escalation attacks are quite easy to exploit. Privilege escalation attacks essentially mean I can become administrator on any system because there are not enough controls. And that I didn't realize that it was that prevalent. It's extraordinary that it is that prevalent.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the really important thing that we try to do here at SonicWall with the threat report, right? Is that you can be in the industry for a long time, but threat actors are not stagnant, right? They're always changing their techniques, and it's important that end users and organizations have up-to-date information on the attacks that are being leveraged, because it may surprise you. And in order to put yourself in the best defensive position and to know that, hey, like implementing a zero trust architecture is important because of this, right? Like that's one of the things that we want to make sure that we're providing intelligence to the community.
And while we're on this topic, I know it's not related to privilege escalation. You had mentioned this LOL bin kind of attack. Can you just talk a little bit about? I know it's a few categories before, but this type of attack that is evading even certain endpoint security products that are running on the device. Like what is that? What is happening there? What are you seeing?
Yeah, absolutely. So LOL bin is kind of a fun term, we joke about it, but it stands for living off the land binaries.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I find myself saying a lot. This isn't necessarily new. This has been around for a long time, and it becomes challenging for defenders to detect these type of attacks, because what's happening is a threat actor, again, they've got into your network somehow, so we're assuming compromised, and they're on your box, and they're not going to bring their own tools with them. They're not going to create some piece of malware or ransomware that the EDR is just going to flag on because it's something that's unusual to the system. What they're going to do is they're going to leverage something already on the system that you already trust, and they're going to leverage that to do malicious or nefarious things. What we're seeing is the three most common, what they refer to as LOL bins, and 80% of the time it's one of these three. It's either PowerShell, command.exe, or it's SCH tasks, or when we're talking about Windows Box. And so the challenge again, how do you know that that's malicious versus not malicious? Now, of course, you're looking for anomalies and different unusual things going across, monitoring those command line examples, for example, and trusting, wait a minute, what applications are supposed to be using these command lines or these tools? Is it where is that coming from? So that's what we're seeing. We see a lot of this. We're continuing to see a lot of binaries already on the system being leveraged for malicious purposes.
Awesome. Yeah, PowerShell is just fundamental. Like, yeah, if you're exploiting PowerShell, it's almost impossible to catch.
It's very difficult. I mean, the statistic we released at the media report was that 90% of malware families are leveraging PowerShell.
Yeah.
That's more than a couple, right? And they're doing it oftentimes for either downloading additional malware, or they're using it to evade defenses.
Yeah.
As the two
and if you turn off PowerShell, you're going to break so many apapplications.
Right.
So many
and so
applications beyond PowerShell.
Exactly. You can't just say, oh, and I've joked about this before. Does that make PowerShell bad? No, PowerShell is not a bad thing. And in no way should we be thinking about, oh, well, we can't use PowerShell in an organization because 90% of malware families are using it. No, that's the wrong mentality. The mentality is, what do I have to do to make sure, one, I'm using PowerShell in the most secure manner possible? It's called hardening PowerShell. There's all kinds of content out there about how to harden PowerShell. And then two, how am I detecting unusual activity within PowerShell? And we could do 7 more webinars on that, right? But that's essentially the core fundamentals.
Awesome. That's a great reminder. We are up on time here, so maybe just I'll quickly recap before we let all the folks who joined us go. Between Doug and I, we covered some of the common threat vectors we are seeing in the space. We spoke about business email compromise. People didn't ask for it, but we went into depth on server-side request forgery. I found that attack really interesting. Talked a lot about ransomware, malware, mobile, and then finally escalation of privilege. And the net of it is, these attacks are rising. They're always going to be there. They're going to come in different forms. And zero trust security is actually fairly basic. Doug calls it defense in depth. It's basically simple principles. Authenticate strongly, no static credentials, rely on device trust and device posture. Device is where you start with trust now. Have explicit access policies, filter, block malicious websites. I mean, it's basic stuff. It's not rocket science. These techniques have been existing for a long time. But what has happened more recently is these all have been packaged up into easy to use products. SonicWall sells some, so do our competitors, but definitely evaluate those and make sure you have zero trust in place in your organization. And zero trust has to be deployed across all platforms. It's not just for your Windows devices. You have to think about mobile. You have to think about users who don't have a client, who access, like contractors with browsers and so on. You need to have an integrated security story. You don't want just islands of security. You want it integrated with your identity, your endpoint security, your device management. And finally, just consider a SOC. Again, SonicWall provides this capability, but you can use other providers as well. You have to be ready to respond to these attacks. They don't happen 9 to 5. The bad guys like attacking at 3 a.m. on a Saturday morning. So you just need to be prepared for these types of attacks. And so thank you so much for joining. Doug, any last words before I wrap up?
These are really important topics that I think we need to continue to talk about. Stay tuned for the threat report that's coming out here in about a month or so to get some of that threat intelligence to help really guide your strategy for defense. And zero trust the way to go, right?
Thank you so much. Really appreciate your time, everyone.